let's zoom through remains. Okay, so we're going to use first, which is my acronym for analysing any new poem, or indeed the ones that we've studied in the anthology. We're going to try and do this in under 15 minutes, and we're just going to apply 5 key annotations to the poem, which you can apply to any poem. And F stands for the first line and last line. Okay, so we're going to mark that with an F. The I stands for imagery. So we're going to find one piece of imagery. It doesn't matter where the imagery comes from. I quite like the, well, I don't like it. It's obviously very unpleasant, but he tosses his guts back into his body. Then we're going to find any repetition. Now in this poem, it's quite easy because we've got the probably armed, possibly not bit. And we obviously have that repeated here. We also actually have a little bit of repetition of some of the other the details there. So we've got kind of like repetition of dozen rounds. There's kind of various little bits of repetition, but essentially those are the bits that stand out. So we're going to mark those with an R. So that's going to be our repetition. Let's put a little R there. Then we're going to look at structure, and the most obvious thing to say about structure is to note that there's, we can just put a little S here for reference. There's no stanzas, there's no rhyme, there's no end stopping, there's no initial capitalization. Now, what does all that stuff mean? Well, essentially, it means that this is very much like prose, very prose-like, or in a simpler way, it reads like speech. It's very what we would call naturalized. Okay, so the only thing that really makes this a poem is the lineation, the fact that it's been arranged in this particular way. And so you can look at where it has its enjambment, you can have a look at where it does its caesuras, you can have a look at any of those kind of things. But the fact of the matter is, we don't have anything really that makes this very poemy. Okay. And then finally, although it's the first thing that we come across in a poem, we're going to have a look at the title, mark it with a T. Okay, so once you've done those things, you're very quickly just going to add some annotations that relate to them. Okay, so remains here. We have some polysemy, which is basically where we have multiple meanings there. When it's, by the way, just a kind of a quick clarify, ambiguity is where you don't know what's kind of intended, whereas polysemy is recognizing that there's deliberately multiple interpretations. Okay, so it's deliberately ambiguous polysemy. Okay, so multiple meaning, poly, semi, poly meaning multiple, semi meaning. Okay, and so what are those two things that it can mean? Well, remains we can have as a verb or as a noun. If remains is a verb, it means that there is stuff that is left over. Whereas if it is a noun, it is kind of, I guess, body parts. Okay. So the way that we can kind of interpret that, which was potentially going to be quite a productive line of inquiry, would be to think about how we can bring those things together and think about PTSD as a concept. Okay, so this memory is left over for the soldier, and it is the remains, the human remains, the body parts that are causing this kind of recurrence in his head. Okay, so the title carries loads and loads of meaning. You can also notice the absence. There is no determiner, and if there's no determiner, it means that we have something kind of more generic. Okay, so it's not the remains. We also don't have, I guess, there is no subject if it were a verb. So it's not it remains or he remains or these things remain or whatever. We have no subject, we have no determiner, which helps to add to the polysemy. So we don't know whether it's verb or noun, but it also means that this is kind of much more open. Okay, so there's loads you can get just from that title. Let's have a look now at the first line. So immediately, on another occasion, okay, on another occasion, that straight away means that this is coming from, okay, this is part of a larger conversation. Okay, this is a very conversational thing, and on another occasion means that there have already been occasions that have been talked about, potentially of a similarly upsetting nature. We get sent out. Look at the grammar there. We get sent out. Okay, so this is what we call passive voice. They are not in control. It's not we went out, it's we get sent out. Okay, so it is the passive voice grammatically, because they are not doing the action is being done to them. We get sent out. So immediately these soldiers are not kind of in control of what's happening. Okay, contrast that then so beautifully. I love it when this happens with the end where his life, right? His life in my hands. Okay, so the responsibility is on the soldier. Okay, the speaker takes responsibility. His life in my hands. Okay, and blood on my hands implying guilt. Okay, so from the beginning, we get sent out, and you'll notice throughout the poem, if you were to read it in depth, you'll notice that there's a very strong sense of giving responsibility or spreading responsibility rather than taking it. So we've got myself and somebody else, all of the same mind, all three of us open fire. And then the detached look, I see as it rips through his life. I see broad daylight rather than I cause it. We've hit this looter. Okay, one of my mates goes by and does this. Then he's carted off in the back of the lorry. So none of it, particularly in the first half, is an acknowledgement by the soldier that he has committed this. It's only at the end where you notice that the responsibility is now his. Okay, so there's a massive change that happens over the course of the poem. Let's take a piece of imagery. So tosses his guts back into his body. This is a very visceral image, and I mean that both figuratively and literally. When I say figuratively, I mean that it kind of makes you feel it in your guts, this kind of really unpleasant, kind of gritty, real image of tossing the guts back into the body. It's really kind of hideous and upsetting, but also visceral in a literal sense, because viscera is your guts. It refers to your tummy. So the fact that his guts are tossed back in, it is a visceral image in every sense of the word. And obviously it is quite frank, as all of this poem is, and it ties in with the kind of the colloquial language that is used by this soldier. This is obviously not a kind of high-ranking, well-spoken soldier. This is, kind of a it's potentially a kind of a working class soldier. It doesn't have much power over what goes on, just kind of takes orders and leads with them, which is kind of a recurring theme in all of the war-based poems in the anthology, and it's worth looking at a little deeper. Okay, so there's our imagery. In terms of repetition, the repetition, probably armed, possibly not, and the dozen times, dozen rounds. The biggest thing to note about the repetition, to be honest, is that he relives the events. If you were to look in detail, you would notice a lot of parallels between the left-hand side and the right-hand side. Burst again through the doors of the bank. You've got the looters raiding a bank. You've got the probably armed, possibly not, probably armed, possibly not. You've got the torn apart. You've got the ripping through his life. You've got the dozen rounds, a dozen times. So the fact is that he relives the events, and that's reflected through the repetition of particular phrasing and particular images in the poem, which obviously ties into what we mentioned briefly before about PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. This is an individual who is going through it, who has been traumatized by the event that he witnessed, i.e., the murder um, that he carried out um, with his fellow soldiers. So there's probably aren't possibly not kind of dichotomy that he doesn't have an opportunity to decode probably versus possibly, probably armed, possibly not. It seems more likely that he is armed, and he needs to repeat that to himself to justify it. So you could also mention that kind of justification attempt by repeating this probably armed bit, only possibly not. So you've got to act. So that repetition is quite an interesting one there. Structurally, we've already talked about the kind of the fact that it is naturalized speech, which ties quite nicely into this working class image. It also makes it seem very realistic, which makes images like the visceral one particularly hard to deal with. Okay, so there we have 5 really good annotations of the poem, which give us a pretty nice overview of what's going on. Then we can layer in the context. A few things of context to consider. Simon Armitage, who wrote this poem, he's the current poet laureate. Obviously not when he wrote this poem, but during this process, he interviewed soldiers who had served in a number of conflicts. Okay, so the interview bit, clearly this idea of it being part of a larger conversation, and also it being very realistic, is attributed to the real interviews that influenced it. The Not Dead is the name of the poetry collection. The writing style of the free verse, prosaic writing, so prose-like writing, preserves the authenticity of the narratives, and looks at this concept of justifiability of war, the effect of PTSD. So having it written in this style enhances the effect that it has. There's no kind of fairy tale beauty or pretty rhymes or anything like that to kind of make it seem harmonious. There is no harmony here. It's very much like prose. It's very raw and kind of unadulterated. In terms of like a real conflict to relate it to, we've got the Iraq War. Highly controversial reasons for kind of invading this country along with the US, and so this kind of immediate sense of like, is this right? Is this kind of when we do things, when we get involved in these conflicts, how justifiable can it be if we don't know why we're there? So this fairly clueless soldier obviously has been to Iraq. If you look at the distant sun-stunned, sand-smothered land, that's clearly making reference to the Iraq War. What happens in this poem, though, quite importantly, is he's home on leave, and that's where the blood shadow is, right? So it's not in the distant sand-smothered land. It is near to the knuckle, here and now. Now, there are 2 ways of interpreting that. Either it is the PTSD aspect of it, meaning that it sticks with him wherever he goes, or that the looters raiding a bank were in his home country, in this country. So like a UK-based intervention, and he's unable to compartmentalize. He's unable to go, well, that was in that different country. It was very foreign, unfamiliar. I can separate that from my mind. The fact that it was in this country with people looking like him, he can't other them. There's kind of lots of things to explore there in terms of what conflict we're talking about. Is it any different? Should it be any different, whether it's far away or whether it's close to home? So there's quite an exciting opportunity, I think, there to explore that reference kind of to Iraq compared with the home stuff and this concept of othering, which is where you make people who are not like you seem so different that you can justify really bad behavior towards them. So there you go, guys. In under 15 minutes, we have covered this fabulous poem, Remains. Got 5 really great annotations. We've laid on some context. Nailed it. Nice.